Hello and welcome. I hope your coffee is warm because today I think you are very excited to look at the new cards from Aetherdrift. However you want to say it. I have been doing this wrong the whole time and I'm fine with it now. But let's look at the cards for Commander that are interesting in any way so that they bring something new. And here's a little bit of a sneak preview, but let's start with Loot the Pathfinder and what he represents. He is green, blue and red and has 3 exhaust abilities in the same colors. And those are the most interesting things about him. So what you can see is that you will have a 5 mana 2/4 with double strike. So it is a very strong little guy. It has vigilance and haste. And the haste can be really important because you can immediately tap him for one of his 3 exhaust abilities. And those abilities you can activate only once until you get to play Loot again, of course. They are, for a green mana you add 3 mana of any one color, so adding you 2 mana. That's pretty strong for a card that just has to tap for it. An exhaust ability that can let you draw 3 cards, which is really strong and can definitely get you out of control really quickly. And an ability that will deal 3 damage to any target, which can also be sometimes needed in a pinch. And I think this will bring about a really interesting Commander deck where you need to bounce Loot or something to get him into play again. And then you can make sure that you can use those exhaust abilities more often. Perhaps you even find a way to go mana positive with the ability to add 3 mana of any color. Perhaps you want to play around with untapping Loot and using the other abilities as well, so that you are flexible and using all of the abilities that this brings you. And of course you can play around with cards that work with exhaust as an ability. So this is pretty exciting, and I think the most exciting, I always start with the thing I find most exciting because I find them most exciting, and I think you will too. But the next one is pretty exciting as well. You wouldn't say this is really a new archetype because you're still just working with vehicles, but in this archetype a lot has changed for vehicles, and I think that was to be expected from this set, of course, a set being about vehicles. So let's look at, from the left to the right, let's look at Chandra first. Chandra says at the beginning of combat, choose 1 vehicle, if you want. Until end of turn, it becomes an artifact creature and gains haste. Meaning you can turn alive one of your artifact creatures and attack with them. That's exactly what this archetype does. It gives you the vehicles, perhaps the mounts as well. And then it will allow you to attack with them, even if you don't have the creatures for it, even if you don't have the power to crew those creatures or settle them. Kolodin works with mounts as well. For example, he gives them haste again, and whenever they enter, they become settled or they become an artifact creature. So immediately you can attack with all of your strong artifacts. So play a really expensive one, they will get haste and they will get to attack right away. I think that is really interesting in a vehicle or mount deck, because often you run into the problem of needing multiple creatures, of needing multiple vehicles, and that's just a little bit too much. But now you can play them and at least attack with them once. Push the Limit is, I think, another great card, even though it's just an uncommon, that will allow you to return all mount and vehicle cards and then attack with them right away. Even though you have to sacrifice them afterwards, this should be a lot of value, because there are many high costed vehicles that you can immediately play and attack with. Then Gonti, which I think is really interesting as well. It's a 4 mana legendary creature and does exactly what you expect Gonti to do. So this one says whenever a player casts a spell they don't own, they create a treasure token. So it sort of rewards your opponents for doing the thing you want to do as well, but you're rewarded as well and you will be doing it the most. It also says whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, so that does include the creatures of your opponents, its controller looks at the top card of the opponent's library and exiles its face down. Not really expecting you or your allies to mill an opponent with it, but you could. It then says they may play the card for as long as it remains exiled. Mana of any type can be spent to cast a spell this way. This is strong for yourself, of course, because every time a creature deals damage to your opponents, you will get to exile one of their cards and play it. But it will also incentivize your opponents to attack your opponents, and I think you will really love that in Commander. Next up is a really interesting mechanic around start your engines, and usually I don't really like the ability for Commander because it forces you to deal damage 4 times over 4 of your turns. So yeah, I really don't really don't like it, because you will need 4 turns to have this ramp up, and it will take a long time. But I think Samut really is a cool way to play around with the mechanic of start your engines. Of course, Samut is all about speed, always has been, so I think this is a really nice flavor fit. She still has all of those speedy abilities, First Strike, Vigilance and Haste, but she now uses start your engines, which will grow up in speed every time you deal, or every time an opponent loses life on each of your turns, and you need to get it up to 4 usually, but this time you will get more effects even from the first speed counter you get. So other creatures will get power where X is your speed, and non-creature spells, which I think is the kicker, you cost X less to cast where X is your speed, meaning you can get up to a 4 mana reduction, which will also be really good with your commander itself. So I think this is a really cool start your engines or speed commander, and it is really flavorful as well. You will be playing all the speedy cards, and you will playing out your creatures really speedy as well, or in a speedy way. Anyways, Mimeoplasm has returned, and he is ugly. I think this is the best art though. It's the Sultai colors again, of course, and it doesn't really do anything new per se, but it does it in a very new way. So as it enters, you exile up to X creature cards. It has X in its mana cost, so that will make you the X number. And then it enters with 3+1 counters for each creature card you have exiled because of that X ability. But that is not all, definitely, because for 2 mana, you can make the Mimeoplasm become a copy of one of the target creature cards exiled with it. So you can switch around with those creatures, and the Mimeoplasm could be maybe a small creature one time with a really cool ability, and then when you attack with it, it can turn into a really big creature with First Strike, and you can force your opponents not to block him. So I think this will be a really interesting one, because your opponents do have to be careful of blocking it, for example, or maybe trying to hit it, because it can turn into a creature with hex proof. So it will basically be all the creatures, you just need enough mana to morph it around. But I think this is a really cool one, and I think the flavor of people revering this Mimeoplasm that looks like this is something to think about. Repurposing Bay, I don't necessarily do just commanders, by the way, but Repurposing Bay I think adds a new thing to the game, because this works with artifacts and then allows you to find an artifact card from your library whenever you sacrifice one of those artifacts with a mana value greater. So that means that you can get to your great artifacts. You will need really creative deck building around this if you are building it, because you will be forced to be able to find something. For example, when you sacrifice a 3 mana artifact, you will have to find a 4 mana artifact that is still impacting the board right away, so that you can really work around this ability. Of course, you can sort of break it by untapping it again, but I think the way of building around this so that every card that you sort of search from your deck will be really impactful is a really cool way to build around your deck. Next up is one of the commander cards. It's Hashaton, the Scarab's Fist. Just 2 mana for this guy, and he also adds blue, so white, black and blue in his colors. And the Scarab's Fist says that whenever you discard a creature card, you may pay 3 mana to return it to the battlefield, sort of as a copy of that card. And it will be a 4/4 black zombie, so it will be sort of eternalized. Or well, it will be eternalized. And that is the flavor as well. He worked for the Scarab God, and now he still does, even though the Scarab God then had another name, so there is a bit of mystery here. I think the ability here is really cool, where you get to discard many creature cards and then just play them for 3 mana. So if you discard a really big creature, you can then return it to the battlefield for just 3 mana. So this is a great recursion commander, I think, and in a very interesting way where you have to discard your cards as well. So because of the limitation, I think this is a really cool commander. Next up is Redshift, which I think is also a really cool commander. It's a 2 mana Gruul Goblin pilot, and he is riding in a cool car in some of the arts. He's a gravity guy sometimes, but more importantly, his abilities, aside from vigilance, he can tap to add X mana where X is its power. So increasing its power, which is very cool and easy to do in Gruul, will allow you to create more mana, which is also already really easy to do in Gruul, but now will be easier and will be a cool way to build around Redshift, maybe with enchantments or something, so that you can keep adding the added mana. And then it has an exhaust ability again for 12 mana. So you would say, how do I get there? Well, with the first ability, you get to put any number of permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. And that is a really cool ability. Definitely if you get to draw a bunch of cards. Don't know how necessarily, maybe because you have a big creature and you have a green spell that will allow you to draw a bunch of cards for the biggest powered creatures on your side of the battlefield. Perhaps. And then you can put all of the permanent cards, and you will basically only have permanent cards in Gruul, onto the battlefield. Isn't that cool? I think it's a really cool, explosive way to win. Then Ketramose, again Amonkhet. It's a 3 mana mythic, and I think the most interesting thing about this here is that it works with exiling things from the graveyard. It loves doing it. It just says, and I think the most important part says, whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from graveyards and or the battlefield, so you can also remove them, during your turn, you draw a card and lose 1 life. So that means that if you can over and over exile cards from your opponent's graveyards, or maybe your graveyard, you get to draw a card. And that can go really explosive, I think. It works really well with the Kaya Planeswalkers. Look them up, it's definitely good. Sorry to say that, I should have looked it up before, but I just came up with the idea. And I think this will be a really cool commander, definitely Planeswalker-wise. Next up, not really impactful power-wise, but I think it's really fun and maybe people know what to do with this. Fang-Druid Summoner is an uncommon that says whenever this creature enters, you may search your library and or graveyard for a creature card with no abilities. Reveal it, put it into your hand, not even on the battlefield, and then you may shuffle your deck, or you have to. I think one cool thing to do with this is find Yargle and Multani. Maybe you have a deck centered about that or something, and you can bring it back, or I don't know, but yeah, I just thought it was fun that they were doing things with cards that don't have any abilities on them, because when will you ever get to break those? Well, maybe with that Fang-Druid Summoner. Next up is a new addition for goblins that definitely changes it. It says add 1 red mana for each goblin you control. And it's definitely not hard to get max speed here, because again you have to deal damage to your opponents. You definitely want to be doing that with goblins. It also gives your goblins haste, at least your other goblins, and it makes more goblins for you. So I definitely think this will add a bunch to that type. Next up, and we did have some abilities that did this before, but Veteran Beast Strider in green and white and Unstoppable Plan in blue say almost the same thing. They say at the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control or untap all non-land permanents you control, and many ways to untap your permanents or creatures every time will add up. Definitely, because at that end step you will get to tap your creatures again, perhaps do something at instant speed, perhaps you find a way to do this even more often and then you can definitely boost your creatures, put +1 counters on them in a human deck or something like that. There are many ways to break these kinds of effects, and I think I'm here for it. The March of the World Ooze, so Mimeoplasm back again. It's a 6 mana enchantment, so you expect it to do a lot, and it definitely does, because creatures you control have base power and toughness 6/6, and they are oozes. But more importantly, all of your small little guys will be 6/6s. So all of your creatures will be really big. So in a token strategy, all of your creatures being 6/6s, if they were Severlings 1/1s in any kind, or maybe plants 0/1s, you can still put +1 counters on them, and they will have that base power and toughness increase. And the enchantment says whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it's not their turn, you create a 3/3 elephant, and if you have this enchantment out still, it will be a 3/3, or it will be a 6/6 elephant ooze. I wanted to add them all together, but that's not how it works. So this will still be a really cool enchantment that will definitely work well with go wide strategies. Radiant Lotus is a 6 mana artifact that allows you to tap it to sacrifice 1 or more artifacts. You can sacrifice 10 if you want. Then you choose a color, and target player, could be your opponents, adds 3 mana of the chosen color for each artifact sacrificed this way. So sacrifice 10 clues and you will get 30 mana. So that will definitely be a win for you if you get to do that. Next up, the Mendicant core. I really like this guy. I really like their flavor as well, how normal they seem to be. It's a 2 mana commander, and I definitely like 2 mana commanders because often they are very easy to cast. Mendicant core's power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. You can do stuff with that, but more importantly, it has that start your engines and then max speed ability that eventually says whenever you cast an artifact, you may copy it for just 1 mana. And I think this can go wild pretty quickly. So I love this guy. There are multiple ways that we have gotten to cheat permanence into play, but this is another one. Nissa says, landfall, create 2 energy, pay 8 energy at any time, I think. No, pay 8 energy rather than pay the mana cost for permanent spells you cast. So you can cast a permanent for just 8 energy, which you can get by getting 4 lands into play or with other energy cards, of course. So I think this will be a really great way to play around with things like Eldrazi. There are multiple things that add to this, by the way, in the set. So perhaps we will be getting more of them in the future, in the near future. There are ways to get things back. Guardian Sunmare is, I think, a cool one. It's a 5 mana mount that says when it attacks while settled, you search your library. So it works like a vehicle. You search your library for a non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less. So a smaller creature, but you can choose, and that is often very strong. Definitely because you can then put it onto the battlefield instead of into your hand. And Salvation Engine, which is a 5 mana vehicle, which is just like a mount, I guess, but then with crew 6 instead of settle 4. And Salvation Engine says other artifacts get +2/+2, so it's definitely a great banner or lord, however you want to say it. And then whenever this creature attacks, you return up to 1 target artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. And definitely you can have a bunch of great artifacts in your graveyard, maybe discard them in there and then return them to the battlefield. And you will have a 6/10 that can attack, so definitely not a small creature itself. Next up, another way to definitely play around with Eldrazi, and the last one is Oviya Automech Artisan. It's a new Elvish Piper and an upgraded one, who would have thought. It's a 4 mana human artificer, so not necessary to play just in elves. It says each creature that's attacking one of your opponents, so again works for your opponents attacking your opponents, will get trample. So all creatures attacking your opponents will have trample. So you will just make sure that your opponents get to deal a bunch more damage to your opponents, and you like that. Then it has the Elvish Piper ability as well. And it has an extra toughness. And a little added ability is that you can also put vehicle cards from your hand onto the battlefield. And again, if that creature or vehicle was an artifact, you may put 2/+1 counters on it. So definitely a great way to cheat creatures into play. And if you were playing Elvish Piper in a non-elf deck, or non-shaman deck, I guess, then definitely Oviya is an upgrade. Or perhaps you wanted to copy the Elvish Piper because Oviya is legendary. And that was it for the interesting things in this set. I have found more than I thought. So let me know which one is your favorite, or perhaps if I have missed one. Let me know in the comments. And I wish you a nice day. Bye. Subscribe.